A secret meeting, one kiss, and her life was never the same. The kiss happened in the quietest way possible. No music swelling in the background, no dramatic interruption, no urgency in the room. Just two people standing too close in a place they had promised themselves would remain ordinary. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. Arden Hale felt it before it happened, the shift in the air, the subtle tightening in her chest, the instinctive awareness that something irreversible was about to unfold. The world didn't slow down. It didn't blur. It sharpened. Callum Reeve stood inches from her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without being touched. His presence wasn't overwhelming. It was steady, deliberate, almost restrained. His hand hovered at his side, not reaching for her, not claiming anything. His eyes searched her face, not with hunger, but with a question he hadn't spoken out loud. This was the moment. The one people talk themselves out of, the one they replay later and wonder what might have happened if they'd been braver. Arden didn't plan to close the distance. She didn't think about what would follow tomorrow, or what would need to be explained, or how neatly arranged her life had been until now. She simply leaned in. The kiss was soft, brief, almost careful. There was no rush in it, no urgency to deepen what had just begun. Their lips met and lingered long enough for certainty to settle in, long enough for Arden to understand, without question, that this wasn't a mistake. Then Callum pulled back, not with regret, just enough to create space again. The space felt louder than the kiss itself. Neither of them spoke. Outside the cafe window, rain tapped against the glass in a slow, steady rhythm, as if the city had decided to keep breathing normally despite what had just happened inside. Callum took a step back, his expression unreadable. Not distant, not cold, measured. "I should go," he said quietly. Arden nodded, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. He left first. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as it closed behind him, the sound echoing longer than it should have. Arden remained where she was, one hand resting on the edge of the table, her heartbeat still out of sync with the room around her. Nothing looked different. The chairs were still pushed in. The lights were still low. The rain still fell at the same unhurried pace. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. That kiss hadn't crossed a line. It had revealed one. If stories about life-changing moments resonate with you, take a second to subscribe to Rust Road Stories. These are the kinds of stories we tell here, the quiet ones that linger long after they end. Back to the story. Earlier that same day, Arden's life had been exactly what she'd designed it to be. Predictable, stable, calm. Her alarm rang at 6:30, as it always did. She moved through her morning routine without checking the clock once. Coffee brewed while she scanned the news. Her apartment remained spotless, untouched by clutter or chaos. Even the view from her window, the same row of buildings she'd looked out at for years, felt reassuring in its sameness. Arden liked control, not in an obvious way. She wasn't rigid or inflexible. She simply believed that structure kept things from falling apart. It allowed life to move forward without unnecessary damage. Her job suited that belief perfectly. As an urban planning assistant for the city, Arden worked behind the scenes, reviewing proposals, coordinating data, supporting decisions she rarely had to defend publicly. She liked contributing without being exposed, helping without being the center of attention. It wasn't ambition that drove her. It was balance. Colleagues described her as reliable, thoughtful, easy to work with. She met deadlines. She listened carefully. She rarely spoke unless she had something worth saying. Her evenings followed a familiar rhythm too. Groceries on Tuesdays, laundry on Saturdays, dinner eaten quietly, usually with something streaming in the background she only half watched. It wasn't loneliness. Arden had friends. She met them for brunch occasionally. She answered texts. She showed up when she was needed. But there was a part of her life she kept untouched, the part that felt dangerous if examined too closely. She told herself she didn't miss anything. That passion was overrated. That steadiness mattered more than intensity. That the people who chased big feelings often ended up bruised by them. She had seen it happen often enough. So when Callum Reeve walked into the conference room that afternoon, Arden didn't register him as a disruption, not at first. He arrived quietly, taking a seat near the end of the table. No show of importance, no attempt to command the room. He listened while others spoke, his attention focused, his posture relaxed but attentive. When he finally introduced himself, his voice was calm and unhurried. "Callum Reeve," he said, "I'm consulting on the infrastructure assessment for the Northern District." That was all. No embellishment, no attempt to impress. Arden glanced up from her notes longer than she intended to. There was something about him that didn't ask to be noticed, but made itself known anyway. His gaze met hers briefly, steady and curious, then moved on without lingering. It should have ended there. Just another meeting, another consultant, another name that would eventually fade into a list of completed projects. Except Callum didn't linger the way other people did. When the meeting wrapped up, he stood, gathered his materials, and left before the room fully emptied. No side conversations, no networking, no lingering presence. Arden watched him go, unsettled by a feeling she couldn't immediately explain. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was awareness, the kind that slips in quietly without permission and refuses to be dismissed. By the time Arden returned to her desk, the feeling hadn't faded. It had sharpened. She shook it off. Moments like that didn't mean anything. People crossed paths every day. Connections were imagined as often as they were real. She returned to her work, unaware that by the end of the night she would be standing in a dimly lit cafe, replaying the sensation of a kiss that had already changed how she understood herself, and unaware that Callum Reeve had already made a decision that would turn that kiss into something far more complicated than she could imagine. Arden didn't think about the kiss the next morning. Not at first. Her body woke before her mind did, moving through familiar motions as if nothing had happened. The alarm chimed. The curtains let in the same pale light. The coffee machine hummed at the same reassuring volume. Routine had always been her anchor. She believed in the comfort of predictability, in knowing what came next, in days that unfolded without surprise. Control wasn't about fear, it was about preservation. She had learned early on that emotions, once unleashed, didn't always ask permission before they took something with them. So she brushed her teeth, pulled her hair back, and dressed for work with practiced ease. Only when she reached for her keys did the memory surface. Not the image of Callum's face. The feeling, the quiet certainty that had settled in her chest the moment their lips met. The stillness of it, the absence of doubt. It wasn't the kind of sensation that demanded attention. It waited patiently, confident it would be noticed eventually. Arden paused by the door. Her hand rested on the handle longer than necessary. She closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself in the weight of the moment. Then she exhaled and left the apartment. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace. People hurried past with coffee cups and headphones. Traffic lights blinked from red to green without ceremony. Nothing acknowledged the shift that had occurred the night before. That was part of what unsettled her. Moments that mattered rarely announced themselves. At the office, Arden settled into her desk, greeted by the low hum of conversation and the steady tapping of keyboards. She opened her email, reviewed her schedule, and began working through the tasks she had left unfinished the day before. Focus came easily, too easily. She didn't replay the kiss. She didn't question it. She didn't dissect the meaning behind Callum's sudden departure or the restraint in his voice when he said he should go. She filed the experience away where she kept everything uncertain, under control. But control, she would later realize, didn't mean absence. It meant delay. Across the floor, a conversation drifted toward her desk. The consultant from yesterday, someone said, "Reeve, I think?" Arden's fingers slowed on the keyboard. "He's back again today," another voice replied. "Temporary assignment, though. In and out, temporary." The word passed through her without resistance, unnoticed for the weight it carried. Arden didn't look up. She didn't need to. The awareness was already there, quiet and persistent, like a low note humming beneath everything else. Callum Reeve wasn't a fixture. He was passing through. Later that afternoon, she saw him again. He stood near the windows this time, reviewing a set of documents with a project manager. Sunlight cut across the room, catching the edge of his profile. He listened more than he spoke, nodding occasionally, his posture relaxed but alert. Arden noticed the way he kept a certain distance, not withdrawn, just measured, as if he knew exactly how close was appropriate, and never crossed it without reason. When his gaze lifted and found hers across the room, the moment stretched. Recognition flickered between them. No smile, no greeting, just understanding. He looked away first. The restraint in that small gesture landed more heavily than the kiss had. It told her something without words. Callum wasn't avoiding her. He was containing something. The realization followed her through the rest of the day. She noticed it in the way he excused himself before conversations turned personal, in how he remained attentive without inviting familiarity, in the way he moved through shared spaces without leaving traces behind. People like that didn't drift. They planned. By the time Arden packed up to leave, the certainty she'd felt in the cafe had evolved into something more complex. It wasn't anticipation. It wasn't regret. It was the growing awareness that she had stepped into a moment someone else had already decided to step out of. That night, Arden didn't turn on the television. She sat by the window instead, watching the city lights blink on one by one. Her phone rested beside her, silent. She didn't expect a message. She didn't know why that hurt more than she thought it would. The kiss replayed then, not as sensation, but as context. Callum's hesitation, the way he waited, the fact that he pulled back first. It hadn't been uncertainty that stopped him. It had been resolve. Arden pressed her forehead lightly against the glass, her reflection faint in the dark. For the first time in years, the order she trusted felt less like protection and more like distance. She wondered how many moments she had organized her way out of, how many times she had mistaken caution for wisdom. Somewhere across the city, Callum Reeve was already preparing to disappear from her carefully structured life, and neither of them had said a word about it. Callum Reeve had always believed that leaving at the right moment mattered more than staying too long. It wasn't a rule he shared with anyone. It wasn't something he announced or defended. It was simply a principle he lived by, quietly, consistently, without drama. He had learned it the hard way. The city assignment had never been meant to last. From the beginning, it was defined by timelines and exit points, a temporary role, a focused objective, no emotional entanglements. He preferred his work that way. Clear, contained, finite. That clarity had kept his life orderly. Until Arden Hale. He noticed her on the first day, not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. While others spoke to be heard, Arden listened with intention. She asked questions that cut through noise. She didn't perform competence. She embodied it. That kind of presence stayed with a person. Callum told himself it was nothing. Professional respect, mutual awareness, a passing alignment of personalities. Except he started adjusting his schedule without meaning to. Not to seek her out, but to avoid lingering where she was. He shortened conversations, left meetings early, maintained a careful distance that felt increasingly deliberate. Restraint, he knew, only worked when it was intentional. The problem was that Arden noticed everything. She noticed how he never spoke about what came next, how his sentences stayed rooted in the present, how he stepped away just as familiarity began to take shape. Callum saw the questions forming behind her eyes and chose silence instead of explanation. He had already submitted his request for reassignment. The decision hadn't come suddenly. It had been forming long before the cafe, long before the invitation, long before the kiss he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. Walking away was the responsible choice. At least, that was what he told himself. The night of the meeting, Callum arrived early. The cafe was nearly empty, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked pavement drifting in each time the door opened. He chose a table near the window where the lights were dim enough to blur the edges of things. He didn't expect Arden to come, not because he doubted her character, but because he hoped she would choose caution. It would make leaving easier, cleaner, When she walked in, shaking rain from her coat, his chest tightened in a way he didn't allow himself to acknowledge. She looked at him like someone stepping into something important without knowing why. That look nearly undid him. Their conversation unfolded naturally without urgency. They spoke about work at first, then drifted carefully into quieter subjects, missed chances, decisions made for the sake of stability, the weight of choosing the sensible path too often. Arden didn't dramatize her reflections. She didn't frame herself as unfulfilled. She simply spoke honestly, with the calm of someone who had made peace with restraint. Callum listened, realizing too late how deeply he had already crossed the line he'd drawn for himself. He hadn't planned for the silence. The moment when words ran out and the space between them became charged with everything unsaid. He hadn't planned for the way her presence felt grounding instead of overwhelming. And he hadn't planned for the kiss. Not really. When he leaned in, it wasn't impulse that guided him. It was clarity. The sudden understanding that if he didn't allow this one moment to exist, he would carry the absence of it longer than he could justify. So he waited. He let Arden choose. And when she closed the distance, he knew with certainty that this was the only moment he would give himself. That was why he pulled away first. Leaving the cafe, Callum didn't look back. He walked through the rain with steady steps, the city lights blurring at the edges. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't slow down. The decision had already been made. The kiss was not an invitation. It was a farewell. The next morning he finalized his exit. Emails sent, schedules adjusted, responsibilities reassigned. No explanation beyond what was necessary. No lingering presence. No loose ends. By the time Arden noticed his absence, Callum Reeve was already preparing to vanish from her life, with the same discipline he applied to everything else. What he didn't anticipate was how heavy leaving would feel. How restraint, once admired, could begin to resemble regret. And how one quiet moment, meant to be contained, could follow him longer than any commitment he'd ever avoided. Arden felt the absence before she could explain it. It wasn't dramatic. There was no announcement, no moment where someone leaned over her desk and said his name with emphasis. The office simply shifted in a way she couldn't immediately place. A chair remained empty during the morning briefing. A voice didn't enter the conversation when it usually would have. A presence she hadn't realized she was tracking failed to appear. At first, she told herself she was imagining it. People came and went all the time. Consultants rotated out. Schedules changed. The city never paused to acknowledge transitions. But by midday, the awareness settled in. Callum hadn't been there all morning. She didn't ask about him. Not because she didn't want to know, but because asking would make the absence real in a way she wasn't ready to face. Instead, she buried herself in work, reading the same paragraph twice without absorbing its meaning. Every quiet moment pulled her back to the cafe, not to the kiss itself, but to the way it ended, the restraint, the space, the decision she hadn't understood at the time. By late afternoon, Arden overheard two colleagues talking near the printers. "Thought he'd be around longer," one of them said. "Apparently not," the other replied. "Temporary assignment, wrapped up faster than expected." The words landed without ceremony. Temporary, wrapped up, no mention of farewells, no explanation beyond logistics. Arden remained where she was, her hands resting flat on her desk. Her heartbeat stayed steady, even as something deeper shifted out of alignment. She realized then that the kiss hadn't unsettled her because it crossed a boundary. It unsettled her because it revealed one she had already been standing near. That evening, Arden walked home slowly. She passed the cafe without looking inside. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflective. Streetlights stretched across the sidewalk in long, broken lines. The city felt familiar again, but distant, as if she were moving through it slightly out of step. In her apartment, she didn't turn on any lights at first. She stood by the window, watching traffic move below, each car carrying someone toward something that mattered to them. Her phone rested on the counter, untouched. No message arrived. And for the first time, Arden allowed herself to sit with the discomfort instead of smoothing it over. She replayed the night with new clarity. The way Callum waited, the certainty in the kiss, the calm finality in his voice when he said he should go. It hadn't been hesitation, it had been intention. That realization pressed in slowly, reshaping the memory until it settled into something heavier and more meaningful than she had expected. The kiss hadn't been the beginning of something reckless. It had been the end of something deliberate. Arden leaned against the window, her reflection faint in the glass. She felt awake in a way she hadn't for years. Unsettled, yes, but undeniably present. Whatever had just passed between them wasn't finished. It had simply moved into a quieter, more complicated space. And she knew with a certainty that matched the one she'd felt in the cafe that her life wouldn't return to the shape it had held before. Not after this, not after him. The city didn't feel different the next morning. That was what unsettled Arden most. She expected something, an echo, a shift in the air, a sense of rupture. Instead, the world continued, as if nothing had been disturbed. Coffee shops opened on time. Traffic thickened and thinned in predictable waves. People stepped into crosswalks without hesitation. Life carried on. Arden moved through it with the same outward composure she always had, but internally something had loosened, not broken, not collapsed, just shifted slightly off-center. At work, she caught herself listening for a voice she told herself she wasn't expecting to hear. Callum's absence had already been absorbed into the routine of the office. Meetings continued. Deadlines pressed forward. No one paused to acknowledge that a consultant had come and gone. That was how temporary roles worked. And yet, Arden felt the absence with precision. She noticed it in the way discussions felt flatter, in the way silence returned too quickly after certain points were made, in how she found herself glancing toward the windows during meetings, half aware that no one would be standing there. She didn't ask about him. Instead, she listened. People revealed more in passing comments than they ever did in formal updates. A mention of timelines, a casual remark about reassigned responsibilities, a passing reference to that consultant who wrapped up early. Each fragment added weight to what she already sensed. Callum hadn't drifted away. He had exited cleanly. That evening, Arden met her friend Elise for dinner, a long-standing ritual neither of them treated as sacred, but both quietly depended on. Elise talked easily, her voice filling the space between bites of food. She spoke about work frustrations, a stalled relationship, a neighbor who played music too loudly at night. Arden listened, asked questions, responded at the right moments. She was good at presence. "What's going on with you?" Elise asked suddenly, studying her over the rim of her glass. Arden hesitated. "Nothing," she said, instinctively. Elise raised an eyebrow, not accusatory, just curious. "You've been quieter than usual." Arden considered offering something vague, a harmless deflection. She'd perfected that skill years ago. Instead, she chose honesty without detail. "I think I had a moment," she said. Elise leaned back slightly. "A good one or a complicated one?" Arden thought of the cafe. The kiss, the silence that followed. "I don't know yet," she replied. Elise smiled faintly. "Those are usually the ones that matter." Arden didn't answer. Later that night, alone again, she replayed the question she'd been avoiding. Why did it matter so much? She had shared moments before, conversations that lingered, connections that hinted at more. None of them had stayed with her like this. The difference, she realized, wasn't intensity. It was clarity. The kiss hadn't overwhelmed her. It hadn't swept her into fantasy or urgency. It had simply aligned something she hadn't known was out of place. That kind of awareness didn't fade easily. As the days passed, Arden began noticing patterns she'd never paid attention to before. How often she chose comfort over curiosity. How readily she stepped away from moments that asked more of her. How skilled she was at maintaining equilibrium, even when it cost her depth. Callum's absence sharpened those observations, not because he had changed her life yet, but because he had briefly illuminated it. By the end of the week, Arden understood something she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. She didn't miss Callum Reeve. She missed the version of herself that had existed in his presence, and that realization unsettled her far more than longing ever could. Arden didn't set out to look for answers. They found her anyway. It started with small disruptions, things she would normally dismiss without thought. A meeting agenda that no longer included a familiar name, a project document she opened out of habit, only to find sections reassigned to someone else. A calendar reminder that now led nowhere. Each detail reinforced the same truth. Callum was gone. Not delayed, not unavailable, gone. The realization should have brought closure. Instead, it introduced a quiet restlessness Arden couldn't ignore. She found herself lingering after meetings, listening more closely than necessary, absorbing fragments of conversations that drifted past her desk. Most of it was procedural, boring, administrative, until it wasn't. He wrapped up early, someone said near the elevators one afternoon. Didn't expect that. Yeah, another replied. Guess he requested reassignment. Said it was better that way. Better that way. The phrase followed Arden back to her desk. She didn't know what it meant, but it sounded deliberate, like a decision that had been weighed carefully before being made. That detail mattered more than she wanted it to. That night, she dreamed of the cafe, not the kiss. The moment before it, the pause, the silence, the question that had hovered between them. When she woke, the certainty returned with her breath. Something had been left unresolved. By midweek, Arden realized she was no longer avoiding the question. She was circling it. Why had Callum left so abruptly? She replayed their interactions with new attention, not searching for meaning where none existed, but noticing what had always been there. His careful distance, his refusal to speculate about the future, the way he had treated the kiss like a moment with edges. She hadn't imagined that restraint. It had been intentional. The idea unsettled her, not because it suggested regret, but because it suggested forethought. At lunch one day, Arden found herself sitting across from Marcus, a senior planner she'd worked with for years. He spoke openly, often without filtering what others preferred to soften. They discussed project timelines until the conversation drifted. "You ever work with Callum before this?" Arden asked, keeping her tone casual. Marcus shrugged. Once. Different city. Something in his expression shifted, just enough to register. "He always leave like that." She pressed gently. Marcus paused. "Leave how?" "Cleanly," Arden said. "Early." He considered her for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah. He's disciplined. Disciplined. He plans his exits," Marcus added. "Never seen him burn a bridge." The words settled into place. That night, Arden walked the long way home. She needed the movement, the space, the chance to think without shaping her thoughts into something neat and manageable. The city lights blurred at the edges as she passed through neighborhoods she rarely visited, her footsteps steady against the pavement. She stopped outside the cafe. The windows were dark now, chairs stacked, the space stripped of warmth and conversation. She stood there longer than necessary, letting the memories surface without resistance. Callum hadn't kissed her because he lost control. He had kissed her because he chose to, and then he had left. The sequence mattered. It reframed everything. Back in her apartment, Arden sat at the kitchen table, her phone lying untouched beside her. She didn't expect a message, but the silence had begun to feel intentional in its own right. She understood then that waiting would answer nothing. Whatever truth existed sat just beyond the edge of her restraint. And for the first time in years, Arden considered stepping past it. The moment arrived without warning. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't even meant for her. That was what made it irreversible. Arden had stayed late, finishing a report she could have easily pushed to the next morning. The office had thinned out, voices replaced by the low hum of lights and the occasional echo of footsteps in distant hallways. She stood near the copy room when two voices drifted in from the corridor. Had his exit lined up before that meeting, one of them said. Arden paused. She hadn't meant to listen. She told herself she would step away. She didn't. "Yeah," the other voice replied. That was already approved. He requested it early. Requested it. Before the meeting, Arden's breath slowed. So whatever happened that night, the first voice continued. It wasn't what made him leave. He was already on his way out. Silence followed, not because the conversation ended, but because Arden had stopped hearing anything else. The timeline rearranged itself in her mind with unsettling precision. The restraint, the distance, the way Callum had waited before the kiss, the way he pulled back first, none of it had been hesitation. It had been intention shaped by an ending she hadn't known existed. Arden stepped back quietly, careful not to announce her presence. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. What she felt was heavier than shock. Clarity. She returned to her desk, closed her laptop without saving, and gathered her things with deliberate calm. No one noticed her leave. No one stopped her. Outside, the air felt sharper. She walked without direction, letting the city carry her forward while her thoughts settled into something unmistakable. Callum Reeve hadn't kissed her because he was uncertain. He had kissed her, knowing he would disappear. The realization didn't hurt in the way she expected. It steadied her, because it stripped the moment of ambiguity. It had been chosen. That night, Arden didn't replay the moment with doubt. She replayed it with understanding. The quiet certainty she'd felt in the cafe made sense now. The absence of urgency. The calm finality. The way the kiss felt complete instead of unfinished. He had given himself one honest moment before leaving, and she had stepped into it without knowing the cost. Standing at her window later, watching the city settle into night, Arden made a realization that shifted something deep inside her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't hurt in the way people expect to be. She was awake. For years, she had believed restraint kept her safe, that choosing stability over uncertainty protected her from loss. But restraint hadn't spared her from anything. It had only delayed the truth. And the truth, now unmistakable, was this. She didn't want her life to be shaped by exits she never questioned. Not anymore. Whatever came next wouldn't be accidental. It would be chosen. Arden didn't intend to revisit the cafe. She told herself it was coincidence. A longer walk home. A need for air. A desire to stay moving instead of sitting alone with thoughts that had grown louder since the truth rearranged itself in her mind. But when she realized where her feet had carried her, she didn't turn away. The cafe looked smaller in daylight, less intimate, less charged. The windows reflected passing traffic instead of rain. People sat inside now, talking openly, unaware that this space had once held something fragile and precise. Arden stood across the street, watching. She wasn't searching for Callum. She knew better. What she was searching for was understanding. Crossing the street, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The familiar bell chimed, indifferent to memory. She ordered a coffee she barely wanted and chose a table near the window, not the one they'd sat at, but close enough to feel the echo. Sitting there, Arden let the moment return to her fully, not as it had felt then, but as it meant now. She remembered the way Callum arrived early, how he chose a table with intention, not convenience, how his posture that night had been different, more still, more focused, as if he were holding himself in check. At the time, she'd read it as attentiveness. Now she recognized it as resolve. He had known. The realization softened the memory rather than hardening it. Arden hadn't been deceived. She had been invited into a moment he believed would be his last opportunity to be honest, with her and with himself. That reframing mattered because it changed how she understood her own choice. She hadn't been impulsive. She had been present. Across the room, someone laughed. Cups clinked. A barista called out an order. Life filled the space easily, without reverence for what had once passed through it. Arden wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grounding herself. The question she had avoided finally surfaced without resistance. What would she have done differently if she had known? The answer came quietly. Nothing. She wouldn't have refused the meeting. She wouldn't have stepped back from the kiss. She wouldn't have chosen safety over truth. That realization carried more weight than regret ever could. Leaving the cafe, Arden felt steadier than she had in days. She understood now that the secret meeting hadn't been secret because it was wrong. It had been secret because it was honest. And honesty, she was learning, carried its own kind of risk. Back at work, the office felt different again, but not because of absence, because of awareness. Arden noticed things she had once let slide past her. How often decisions were made without reflection. How frequently people accepted timelines and exits without question. She had done the same for years, until one kiss disrupted the pattern. Late that afternoon, an email landed in her inbox. No subject line, no greeting, just a name she hadn't expected to see again. Callum Reeve. Her pulse remained steady as she opened it. The message was brief. I don't know if hearing from me is welcome, but I wanted to say something I didn't allow myself to say before I left. Arden read the words once. Then again. The space between what had been and what could still be narrowed in that moment, not through urgency, but through choice. She closed her laptop slowly. Whatever came next would not unfold by accident, and this time, she would not let restraint decide for her. Arden didn't reply to the email right away. She read it again, slower this time, letting each sentence settle without rushing toward meaning. Callum's words carried the same restraint she remembered, careful, deliberate, shaped by consideration rather than impulse. He hadn't asked a question, nor made a request. He had simply opened a door. Arden shut down her computer and leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the street, softening edges, blurring certainty. For years, she had trusted silence. She believed that if something truly mattered, it would demand space. That unanswered moments would resolve themselves without interference. That patience was a form of wisdom. But patience had also kept her still. The email waited. When she finally responded, she didn't overthink it. "You can say it," she typed. "I'm listening." She sent the message before she could revise it into something safer. The reply came later that night. Callum didn't apologize. He didn't explain himself away. He wrote with the same calm precision she remembered. "I didn't leave because of what happened between us. I left because I knew what would happen if I stayed." Arden read the line several times. "I didn't trust myself to keep choosing distance once I understood what that moment meant. So, I chose absence instead." The honesty in that admission landed harder than any confession could have. She imagined him writing it, measured, thoughtful, refusing to dramatize something that had clearly cost him more than he wanted to admit. "I didn't want to leave damage behind," the message continued, "and I didn't want to pretend the kiss was nothing. It deserved more respect than that." Arden closed her eyes briefly. Respect. That was the word that anchored everything. When she replied this time, she didn't hold back. "You didn't leave damage," she wrote. "You left clarity." There was a pause before his response arrived. "Would you be willing to talk? Not to revisit what happened, just to understand it fully." Arden didn't hesitate. Yes, they chose a different place this time. No cafe, no quiet corners meant to soften conversation. Instead, they met in a public park near the river, early evening light settling into gold around them. People passed by without notice. Dogs pulled at leashes. The world stayed open, unhidden. Callum arrived on time. When Arden saw him, the familiarity surprised her, not because it felt unchanged, but because it felt grounded. He looked the same, calm, composed, but something in his posture had shifted. He wasn't holding himself back. They walked side by side at first, letting the space between them remain unclaimed. "I didn't know if you'd come," Callum said eventually. "I didn't know if I would," Arden replied honestly. They stopped near the railing overlooking the water. The river moved steadily below them, unbothered by pauses or uncertainty. Callum turned to face her. "I should have trusted you with the truth," he said. That night, before the kiss, Arden studied him. "You trusted me with the moment," she replied. "That mattered." He nodded. "I didn't want the moment to ask more of you than it should, and I didn't want it to mean less than it did," she said. Silence settled between them, not tense, not charged, just present. Callum exhaled slowly. "I've spent a long time believing that leaving was the responsible choice. And now?" Arden asked. Now I think responsibility also includes staying, when staying is honest. The admission wasn't dramatic. It didn't ask for forgiveness or promise permanence. It simply existed. Arden felt the weight of her own realization rise to meet it. I don't want my life shaped by exits. I never question, she said. I've done that long enough. Callum looked at her then, really looked at her, without measuring distance or consequences. Then let's question this one together, he said. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. The connection between them had shifted into something quieter and more deliberate, no longer defined by secrecy, but by intention. As they resumed walking, Arden felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not certainty, agency. The secret meeting had changed her life, not because of what happened in that moment, but because it taught her she was allowed to choose what came next. And this time, she intended to. Clarity didn't erase the silence. It reshaped it. After the meeting by the river, Arden didn't feel the rush she might have expected. There was no sudden lightness, no immediate sense of resolution. What settled instead was something quieter and heavier. Responsibility, not the kind imposed by circumstance or expectation, the kind that comes with choosing to see something clearly and refusing to look away afterward. Callum didn't message her that night. Neither did she. The absence between them no longer felt like avoidance. It felt intentional, as if both of them understood that what had just been acknowledged deserved space to breathe. In the days that followed, Arden noticed how easily her life tried to return to its old rhythm. Morning routines resumed, meetings stacked neatly on her calendar, emails filled her inbox with familiar urgency. The city continued to move at its practiced pace. On the surface, nothing had changed, but Arden moved differently through it. She paid closer attention to moments she once rushed past, the way her breath slowed when she allowed silence instead of filling it, the subtle resistance she felt when habit tried to reclaim control. At work, she found herself questioning assumptions she had previously accepted without thought. Why did certain decisions always default to convenience? Why did endings go unexplored while beginnings were celebrated? These weren't dramatic revelations. They were small shifts in awareness, but they accumulated quickly. Callum remained absent from her daily life. No shared spaces, no accidental proximity, no quiet glances exchanged across rooms. And yet, he was present in ways she hadn't anticipated, in the pauses before decisions, in the questions she now asked herself, in the awareness that restraint could be chosen, but it didn't have to be automatic. One evening, as Arden prepared dinner, her phone vibrated softly on the counter. A message, not from Callum, from herself, in a way. Elise, you've been quiet. Walk. Arden hesitated, then replied, yes. They met in a small park near Arden's apartment, the air cool and steady. The sky had begun to dim, stretching the day into something reflective rather than rushed. They walked without direction at first, letting the rhythm of movement ease conversation into existence. You feel different, Elise said after a while, not probing, observant. Arden considered the statement before answering. I think I am, she said. Elise glanced at her. Different how? More present, Arden replied. Less buffered. Elise smiled faintly. That sounds uncomfortable. It is, Arden admitted. But it also feels honest. They walked in silence for a few moments. You going to tell me what happened? Elise asked gently. Arden thought about it. She didn't offer details. She didn't recount events. She didn't explain timelines. She spoke about the shift instead, about realizing she had lived carefully enough to avoid being changed, about encountering someone who hadn't tried to disrupt her life, but had still altered how she saw it. Elise listened without interrupting. When Arden finished, Elise nodded slowly. Sounds like you met someone who didn't ask you to be different, she said. Just more yourself. That landed quietly and deeply. Callum felt the silence differently. Where Arden experienced it as an adjustment, Callum experienced it as resistance. He had returned to his previous city, back into routines that once felt familiar and now felt faintly misaligned. His apartment was exactly as he'd left it. His work resumed without complication, his days filled with structure and purpose. And yet, something unsettled him. He noticed it in the way his attention drifted during meetings, in the pauses he allowed where efficiency once ruled, in the questions he asked himself late at night when discipline loosened its grip. He had believed leaving was the responsible choice. He still believed that. What challenged him now was the realization that responsibility didn't end at departure. It followed. He had expected the kiss to fade into memory, contained, defined, resolved by distance. Instead, it remained precise and present, not as longing, but as clarity. He hadn't misread the moment. That knowledge mattered. One evening, Callum found himself standing at his kitchen window, watching the city settle into night. He hadn't planned to message Arden. He wasn't searching for reassurance. He simply recognized something he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. Leaving had protected him from immediate complication. It had not protected him from truth. He typed slowly. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not letting exits go unquestioned." He paused before sending it, then continued. "I don't want to turn clarity into distance again." The response didn't come immediately. When it did, it was brief. "Then don't." Callum exhaled. For the first time in years, he felt the unfamiliar weight of staying, not physically, but emotionally, and instead of stepping away from it, he allowed himself to remain. Across the city, Arden read his message and felt the quiet recognition settle in her chest. This was no longer about a kiss. It was about two people learning how not to retreat when something asked to be met honestly. The silence between them hadn't ended. It had evolved. Memory is never fixed. Arden understood that now. What had once felt like a single, self-contained moment had begun to stretch, revealing layers she hadn't known were there. The kiss no longer existed as an isolated point in time. It was part of a sequence, one that made sense only when viewed from the end backward. She noticed the change in how she remembered it. At first, it had been sensation, then meaning, now, intention. The cafe returned to her mind in fragments. The way Callum chose his seat, how his attention never drifted. The way his voice remained calm even when the conversation edged toward vulnerability. She had mistaken that calm for ease. It hadn't been ease. It had been control held firmly in place. The realization didn't diminish the moment. It sharpened it. Arden sat on her living room floor one evening, papers spread around her, work half finished. She wasn't distracted. She was reflective. The kind of reflection that arrives only when something has already shifted. She thought about how rarely she allowed herself moments without contingency plans. How often she chose restraint automatically, without asking whether it was necessary. The kiss hadn't broken that pattern. It had exposed it. That was the part she hadn't expected. She had spent days asking herself why the moment lingered. Now she understood. It lingered because it represented a version of herself that had acted without preemptive retreat. She had been present. And presence, she was learning, carried consequences, but also clarity. The message from Callum replayed in her mind. "I don't want to turn clarity into distance again." Neither did she. Their next conversation didn't begin with memory. It began with truth. They spoke over the phone this time, not because distance demanded it, but because it removed distraction. No body language to interpret, no pauses to fill with assumption. Just voices. Measured, honest. "I've been trying to understand why that moment mattered," Arden said quietly. Callum didn't interrupt. "And I realized it wasn't because it felt forbidden," she continued. "It mattered because it felt aligned, like something I'd been avoiding finally caught up to me." Callum exhaled slowly. "I didn't expect that kiss to change anything," he said. "I thought it would let something end cleanly. And instead?" Arden asked. And instead it made it impossible to pretend the connection was incidental. There was no drama in his voice, no self-reproach, just acknowledgement. "I don't regret leaving," he added, "but I regret believing distance was the only responsible response." Arden closed her eyes briefly. For the first time, she heard something beneath his restraint. Willingness. "I don't want to repeat the version of myself who always steps away first," she said. "And I don't want to chase something either. I want intention." Callum considered that. "Then we don't rush," he said, "and we don't disappear." The simplicity of it settled something between them. They didn't make promises. They didn't define outcomes. They agreed to presence. When the call ended, Arden remained still for a long moment, phone resting against her palm. The kiss, she realized, had never been about romance alone. It had been a turning point. It asked both of them the same question. Would they continue living lives shaped by exits, or would they allow something meaningful to take up space? That question lingered now, no longer unanswered. And for the first time, Arden felt ready to live inside it. Arden didn't wake up different. There was no surge of resolve waiting for her in the morning light. No sudden certainty wrapped neatly around her thoughts. The day began the same way so many others had. Quiet, measured, predictable. But something underneath had shifted. For the first time, she recognized the pattern clearly. She had always been excellent at reacting, at adjusting, at accommodating circumstances once they presented themselves. What she had rarely done, what she had almost never allowed herself to do, was initiate change without being forced into it. She made good choices. She made safe ones. She made reasonable ones. What she didn't make were intentional emotional choices, unless the ground had already moved beneath her feet. Callum hadn't caused that realization. He had simply brought it into focus. Arden sat at her kitchen table with her coffee cooling beside her, her phone face down. She wasn't waiting for a message. She wasn't bracing for silence either. She was deciding. The difference mattered. By mid-morning, she knew what she needed to do, not because it felt comfortable, but because it felt honest. She needed to stop letting distance define the limits of her life. That didn't mean chasing something blindly. It didn't mean abandoning the steadiness she valued. It meant choosing presence deliberately, even when restraint felt easier. She picked up her phone and typed, "I don't want this to live only in conversations and pauses. If we're going to stay present, I want to do it openly." She sent the message without rereading it. The reply came later, measured as always. "Then let's meet where nothing needs to be hidden." They chose a weekend afternoon, neutral, unguarded, uncomplicated. A bookstore cafe near the edge of the city, busy enough to feel grounded, quiet enough for conversation. When Arden arrived, Callum was already there. He stood when he saw her, not out of formality but awareness. The way someone acknowledges the weight of what's about to be said. They didn't sit immediately. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. This version of proximity felt different from the cafe weeks ago. Less charged, more substantial. "Thank you for coming," Callum said. "Thank you for not disappearing," Arden replied. He smiled, not broadly, not lightly. Something steadier. They sat. Conversation came easily at first. They spoke about ordinary things. Work, books, the rhythm of their weeks. The normalcy mattered. It grounded what followed in reality instead of projection. Eventually, Arden shifted forward slightly, resting her forearms on the table. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "Not because I need certainty, but because I don't want to default to silence again." Callum nodded, attentive. "I don't want to build something that only exists in careful distance," she continued. "And I don't want to pretend I'm unaffected just because I can function well that way." He considered her words carefully. "I don't want to rush into anything that asks more than it should," he said. "But I also don't want to keep choosing absence when presence is an option." The alignment between those two truths settled between them. This wasn't a declaration, it was an agreement. They spoke openly then, about boundaries, about timing, about the reality of their lives, about the fact that connection didn't guarantee permanence, but avoidance guaranteed stagnation. No promises were made. No futures were claimed. What was chosen instead was something quieter and stronger. Deliberate continuation. They left the cafe together, walking side by side without urgency. The city moved around them, indifferent and alive, offering no commentary on what had just shifted. At the corner, they paused. Callum looked at her, searching, not for permission, but for understanding. "This feels different," he said. "It is," Arden replied, "because I'm not stepping into it by accident." He nodded. This time, when they kissed, it wasn't shaped by farewell. It was unhurried, grounded, open-ended. No rush, no restraint born of fear, just presence. As they pulled back, Arden felt something settle into place. Not certainty, not expectation, but alignment. For the first time, the choice was hers. And she had made it without waiting for the moment to force her hand. Arden didn't measure change by grand gestures anymore. She noticed it in smaller ways. In how she no longer rushed through mornings just to stay ahead of the day. In how she paused before answering questions, giving herself space to respond honestly instead of efficiently. In how silence no longer felt like something to fill. Life hadn't transformed overnight. It had settled. Callum became part of her days gradually, without disruption or urgency. There were no dramatic declarations, no promises carved into certainty. They met when they could, talked when it mattered, let things unfold without forcing meaning onto every moment. What surprised Arden most was how normal it felt. Not dull, not flat, grounded. She had always believed that meaningful change had to arrive loudly, that it had to announce itself with chaos or risk. Instead, this change moved quietly through her life, altering how she related to herself before it altered anything else. She was still careful, still thoughtful, still someone who valued steadiness, but she was no longer hiding behind restraint. Callum noticed it too, not because she became someone new, but because she stopped disappearing from her own life. She asked for what she needed. She questioned what no longer made sense. She allowed moments to stay unresolved without rushing to control their outcome. One evening, weeks later, they sat together on her balcony as the city eased into night. The air was cool, the sky washed in fading light. "This feels stable," Callum said quietly. Arden smiled. "I used to think stability meant never being changed. And now?" he asked. "Now I think it means choosing what stays." He nodded, understanding without needing explanation. They didn't talk about the cafe often, but sometimes Arden thought about that first kiss, not with longing or nostalgia, but with appreciation. It had been a moment shaped by honesty, even if the honesty hadn't been complete at the time. It had shown her something she hadn't been ready to see before, that she didn't need disruption to grow, she needed intention. Looking back, Arden realized the kiss hadn't changed her life by itself. What changed her life was what she did afterward. She stopped letting exits go unquestioned, stopped mistaking silence for wisdom, stopped assuming that distance was always the responsible choice. Instead, she learned how to stay present, even when presence felt uncertain. And that lesson extended beyond Callum. It shaped how she worked, how she listened, how she showed up in friendships, how she allowed herself to be seen without over-explaining. Love, she realized, wasn't about intensity or drama. It was about clarity, about recognizing when something mattered and allowing it to take up space without rushing to define its ending. The secret meeting no longer felt secret. It felt like a turning point, not because of the kiss, but because it asked a question she finally answered. Would she keep living a life built entirely on restraint? Or would she allow herself to choose, with awareness, courage, and intention? She chose, and that choice, quiet as it was, made all the difference. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever faced a moment that quietly changed how you see your life, take a second to reflect on it. And if you enjoy stories that explore love, choice, and the moments that shape us, subscribe to Rust Road Stories for more. Sometimes the smallest decisions leave the deepest marks.